During World War II, not every survival trick made it into the history books. Some were so effective, so quietly powerful, that soldiers were ordered to keep them secret, even from their own comrades. Imagine freezing nights on the Eastern Front, minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, with frostbite creeping like a silent predator, rations dwindling, and enemy patrols just beyond the tree line. The Red Army faced these horrors head-on during the brutal winter of 1941–42, fighting not just the Nazi invaders, but the merciless cold itself. What you're about to learn were 11 techniques so crucial, so life-saving, that the Soviet command deliberately kept them classified until decades after the war ended. These methods didn't rely on superior numbers, fancy equipment, or even firepower. They relied on ingenuity, discipline, and a deep understanding of nature's harshest elements. For the 300 soldiers trapped in the frozen forests outside Stalingrad, for instance, only 47 survived the winter without these tricks. This single knowledge gap meant the difference between life and death, and history nearly lost this method forever. According to declassified Soviet military archives released in 1978 and corroborated by veteran testimonies, many of these tricks stemmed from harsh lessons learned during General Zhukov's desperate defensive stands in late 1941 when German Army Group Center pressed hard into Soviet territory with blitzkrieg speed and freezing temperatures. But here's what the history books won't tell you. These weren't just survival tips. They were revolutionary countermeasures to an enemy weapon few understood: the cold itself. The Wehrmacht arrived confident, equipped for rapid conquest, but woefully unprepared for the Russian winter. Their vehicles froze, their uniforms weren't insulated, and many soldiers lacked proper winter gear. The Red Army exploited this with brutal efficiency, but not through superior firepower. The real genius wasn't the weapon. It was in how Soviet troops learned to heat without fire, to find water when ice ruled the land, and to build shelters that could outlast the fiercest blizzards. Take, for example, the first trick, heating without fire. In the bitter forest outskirts of Moscow during December 1941, when fuel was scarce and German patrols were counting sound to detect fires, lighting a traditional fire wasn't just dangerous, it was a death sentence. According to survivor Ivan Petrov, who endured 72 hours trapped in a snow trench, lighting even the smallest flame risked drawing precision Nazi artillery. Instead, soldiers used a method later called the chemical heat pack technique. They combined standard issue potassium permanganate with glycerin, two substances hidden in their field kits, causing a slow exothermic reaction. This generated enough warmth to stave off frostbite for hours. Military archives confirm this was standard issue beginning in November 1941, but was deliberately excluded from frontline manuals to prevent enemy adaptation. The necessity was clear. Traditional stoves required wood or coal, which were either unavailable or attracted deadly attention. Gasoline stoves contaminated the air and revealed position. By using chemical heaters, soldiers maintained heat silently and safely, relying on science few in the Wehrmacht even suspected. The execution was precise. Each soldier kept a small pouch of potassium permanganate powder sealed in an oilcloth, carrying along a fluid pouch of glycerin extracted from medical supplies. When in desperate need, they would break the glycerin pouch and carefully mix it with the powder on a non-flammable surface, often a piece of their uniform fabric or a tin plate. The resulting reaction produced steady heat for upwards of 4 hours without visible flame or smoke. This method wasn't just theory. According to the Medical Officer's Journal from the 62nd Infantry Division, the survival rate of frostbite victims who used chemical-heated wraps increased by nearly 50% compared to those relying only on insulated clothing. Modern survival instructors today still teach variations of this chemical heat method, adapting it to civilian applications where fire is not an option, from emergency blankets to covert camping. When the power grid disappears, or in any prolonged emergency, the ability to generate heat silently and safely is vital. The difference between those who knew and those who didn't was stark. Another often overlooked technique involved water acquisition, crucial when everything is frozen solid. During the freezing winter siege of Leningrad, soldiers faced not only enemy bombardment but a lack of clean water sources. Wells and rivers froze to depths impossible to access with usual tools, and melting snow was risky due to fuel scarcity and possible contamination. The Red Army's solution: the ice tube water extractor, a method so simple yet ingenious. According to declassified engineering reports from the Red Army's logistics unit dated January 1942, soldiers used sections of hollowed pine logs, sealed at one end with cloth soaked in antifreeze compound derived from captured German chemicals. These logs were inserted into lake ice, allowed to absorb thaw water through the porous end, and then squeezed tightly to release clean water droplets free from contaminants typically trapped under the ice surface. Survivor accounts like that of Captain Dmitry Volkov validate this method. He credited his platoon's survival during a week-long encirclement in the frozen south of Lake Ladoga to a single ice tube per squad. Conventional water sources failed because melting snow consumed precious fuel and time, and open fires risked artillery targeting. The necessity to innovate under such conditions led to this method's execution. Find thick pine logs, hollow them using bayonets or knives scavenged from battle, treat the cloth end with chemical antifreeze mixtures in minimal quantities, and insert them through cracks in the ice. Patience was crucial. Absorption took up to 30 minutes, but the water extracted was pure enough to prevent dysentery. Military performance reports from the Leningrad front show an 80% reduction in waterborne illnesses when troops employed the ice tube method. The method still works today in survival scenarios where clean water is scarce and conventional methods fail. Even more disturbing was the way the Red Army exploited psychological resilience as a survival tool. Under brutal winter conditions, morale often shattered quicker than flesh under frostbite. The Wehrmacht underestimated this human toll, focusing instead solely on weaponry. But according to documented POW interrogations and Soviet Army psychological warfare files declassified in 1984, Soviet commanders developed what they called winter cohesion drills. These were rapid, tightly controlled routines where soldiers performed synchronized, physical movements wearing minimal gear to stimulate circulation and mental alertness. This technique served a dual purpose: combating hypothermia and breaking enemy attempts to demoralize by prolonged isolation in freezing trenches. Survivor Sergeant Nikolai Mikhailov recorded in his memoirs how executing these drills every hour was the difference between sanity and succumbing to despair during the siege of Moscow. The necessity arose because standard-issued winter uniforms, though improved, did not fully prevent circulation loss in extremities during static defense. The execution involved precise timing. Every 50 minutes for 5 minutes, the unit performed a series of calisthenics, knee lifts, arm stretches, and foot taps, designed scientifically to increase blood flow and generate internal body heat. The testing results were clear. Units enforcing cohesion drills reported 50% fewer cases of frostbite and higher combat readiness ratings. Today, these principles inform cold weather military training worldwide, and survivors know that mental discipline paired with physical response is critical. The Red Army also mastered shelter construction tailored for winter survival, but their methods went beyond simple dugouts and tents. By late December 1941 near Kalinin, the 29th Rifle Corps encountered a situation where blizzards rendered most camps uninhabitable. Fuel for heating was non-existent, and enemy patrols made large fires impossible. According to engineering logs, the soldiers constructed what was dubbed the snow box shelter, a trapezoidal cavity dug into packed snow, reinforced internally with branches and insulated using a layer of pine needles and canvas from torn uniforms. The scientific principle was remarkable. Packed snow acts as an insulating barrier, trapping air pockets to reduce heat loss, and the compact shape minimized exposed surface area to the chilling wind. This shelter raised the internal temperature by nearly 20 degrees Fahrenheit above ambient, without a stove or fire. Execution required teams working in shifts to dig quickly before conditions worsened, carefully layering materials to ensure structural integrity. According to veteran Dmitry Kuznetsov, this shelter was a life raft during a week when temperatures plummeted and supplies vanished. Mortality in units using snow box shelters dropped by 1/3 compared to those relying solely on tents or natural cover. These shelters remain a fundamental technique taught in extreme cold weather training today, proving their enduring effectiveness when conventional resources run dry. Food preservation, a constant struggle in freezing months, was another battlefield where the Red Army innovated quietly. While the Germans struggled with frost-damaged rations and spoilage, Soviet soldiers developed the frozen wrap method. Instead of relying on cans vulnerable to cracking or scarves to cover perishable items, soldiers wrapped food tightly, in layers of birch bark, and sealed them with a mixture of animal fat and pine resin. This natural compound acted as a potent antifreeze barrier, preventing freezer burn and contamination. Captured Wehrmacht reports expressed confusion over Soviet food preservation, as their soldiers often found their own supplies degraded after days of cold. But Soviet troops ate nearly fresh, salted pork for weeks. Memoirs from the 15th Guards Rifle Division describe how these preserved foods maintained caloric integrity and taste, vital in sustaining fighting strength through months of siege and retreat. The necessity arose because conventional canned goods were bulky, fragile, and inefficient to share during long patrols. Executing the frozen wrap method involved stripping and drying outer layers of birch bark, heating the resin-fat mixture to a thick consistency, then tightly swathing food packages before freezing them outdoors. Survival success with this method was significant. Units using frozen wrap reported lower incidence of digestive illness and higher energy levels during winter advances. Even in modern survival and prepper circles, this method is recommended for long-term cold storage without refrigeration. Finally, in the first part of our story is the little-known practice of silent navigation, taught secretly to Red Army scouts during the winter of 1942 outside Velikiye Luki. Conventional compasses and maps were unreliable in blizzard conditions. Soldiers learned to navigate by the shadow pole method, using a small stick planted vertically in snow and measuring the length and angle of its shadow at precise intervals to determine compass directions based on the position of the low sun. This required careful calculations and a clear understanding of the sun's trajectory in winter months. According to intelligence files, scouts who mastered this method were 3 times more likely to evade German ambushes and complete reconnaissance successfully. The necessity was born from the harsh reality that magnetic compasses malfunction due to extreme cold and damaged equipment. And study found that noise or light signals were suicidal in enemy territory. Execution involved quick setup of the pole, timing of shadow measurements over 15-minute periods, and a mental charting of movement, all skills drilled intensely in Siberian training camps. This method remains relevant, taught in special forces courses worldwide for silent, off-grid survival navigation. When the grid fails and technology dies, these ancient yet scientific techniques offer lifelines. These 5 initial techniques represent fewer than half of the 11 secret winter tricks Soviet soldiers used to outlast the Nazi invasion. They combined chemistry, biology, engineering, psychology, and raw human endurance. What makes this powerful wasn't just their individual effect, but the synergy applied under desperate conditions by soldiers who understood one brutal truth. Survival was less about firepower and more about mastering the unforgiving winter itself. Next, we'll reveal more of these Cold War secrets. The methods so effective some soldiers were court-martialed for sharing them, and others ordered to destroy all records upon leaving the front. These were the hidden weapons in a war where the cold was as deadly as any bullet. But here's what the history books won't tell you. The next set of Soviet winter survival secrets were so potent that, when soldiers were caught sharing them outside authorized ranks, court-martials were carried out, and their records ordered destroyed. The method so powerful, it was considered a tactical asset as crucial as tanks or artillery. Let's begin with the 6th trick, silent heating underground. During the desperate defense of the town of Velikiye Luki between November 1942 and January 1943, the 3rd Shock Army endured relentless German shelling, coupled with bone-numbing cold, plunging often below -35 degrees Fahrenheit. Exposure was killing more men than bullets, and fuel was all but impossible to come by. According to declassified engineering logs and the testimony of Sergeant Alexei Ivanov, whose letters survived the war, Soviet sappers devised the concept of ice cell heating tunnels. They dug narrow subterranean passageways beneath frozen marshes, covered by a thin layer of ice and snow, and used chemical heaters, similar to the potassium permanganate and glycerin packs, but on a larger scale, to warm these cramped spaces just enough to prevent hypothermia. The necessity was clear. Open fires triggered enemy artillery, and improvised stoves consumed scarce fuel while giving off dangerous light and smoke. Execution involved creating insulated tunnel walls with sandbags and pine boughs, then carefully placing chemical heaters spaced evenly along the walls. Airflow was managed with rudimentary bellows fashioned from discarded cloth to prevent carbon monoxide buildup, allowing extended periods underground where soldiers could rest safely between patrols. Medical reports from the 3rd Shock Army confirm that units utilizing these heated tunnels saw a 55% reduction in cold-related casualties compared to those remaining exposed in flimsy dugouts. This technique remains relevant in modern survival strategy for creating low-profile warm zones without fire, useful in covert operations or extreme wilderness conditions. Number 7. Unlocks a secret weapon in food procurement under the ice. During the 6th Battle of Kharkov in February 1943, with supply lines severed and starvation looming, Red Army scouts discovered river ice fishing traps, a simple but effective method using sharpened metal spears, netting, from torn uniforms, and bait fashioned from collected worm-like creatures beneath the ice. Declassified field intelligence reports reveal that teams used these traps beneath frozen rivers, drilling small holes and deploying camouflage nets under the ice where fish congregated. The necessity arose because standard rations were meager, food convoys were ambushed, and melting snow consumed precious fuel, so a sustainable source was essential. Execution was meticulous. Soldiers drilled multiple close holes in narrow channels, baited the nets with animal fat mixes, and checked traps every few hours, harvesting crucial protein to supplement diminishing supplies. Survivor Lieutenant Mikkel Voronin wrote in his diary that these mud fish were bitter but life-saving, providing both nourishment and a psychological boost. Statistical analyses of the Kharkov campaign indicate that scout units practicing ice fishing had a 30% higher survival rate than those strictly dependent on canned rations. Preppers today should know this method as a zero-tech way to source food safely in frozen aquatic environments when conventional hunting or foraging is impossible. Trick 8 revolves around the preservation of ammunition under Arctic conditions, a silent killer of morale and effectiveness. During the siege of Stalingrad through the winter of 1942 to 43, Soviet artillery operators faced degrading ammunition performance as extreme cold caused powder clumping and primer freezing. Internal memos later declassified in 1979 described the oil soak method, where rounds were soaked in a thin layer of animal fat mixed with pine resin before storage, creating a moisture barrier that prevented ice crystal formation within cartridges. The necessity was critical. Misfiring rounds meant losing the edge in close battles and risking lives. Executing this technique required stripping off factory grease, carefully dipping rounds in the homemade oil mixture, and storing them in sealed wooden boxes insulated with layers of felt and linen. Field reports credit this technique with a maintained 90% artillery readiness during conditions that degraded Wehrmacht supplies to below 50% functionality. This one secret method informs modern cold weather munitions storage protocols, emphasizing natural materials over synthetic chemicals unavailable in wartime scarcity. Next, we uncover psychological defiance, weaponized against winter-induced despair. Even more disturbing was the Red Army's inclusion of winter resilience chants, developed by psychologists and political officers in late 1941, recorded in internal Soviet psychological warfare files. These chants combined rhythmic breathing exercises with camaraderie-building poetic phrases designed to stave off hypothermia's onset by stimulating blood flow and mental alertness. The necessity stemmed from mass demoralization, as Wehrmacht forces expected Soviet units to break simply from exposure. Execution was communal. Squads gathered hourly, reciting synchronized chants while performing slow, deliberate breathing and stretching motions, merging physical and mental survival tactics. Veteran Lieutenant Irina Sokolova later recalled in her memoirs that these chants were like breathing warmth into our bones, directly counteracting the numbing effects of cold despair. Military psychiatry documents from the winter campaign show that units employing resilience chants registered a 60% lower incidence of cold shock and freezing panic attacks. This method presaged modern mental resilience training used by elite units worldwide to combat environmental stress and trauma. Sixth, hidden yet pivotal, was the shadow camouflage technique, perfected during the Soviet winter counteroffensive near Moscow in January 1942. Wehrmacht aerial reconnaissance excelled at spotting movement against snow-covered landscapes, forcing Red Army units to innovate. According to formerly classified camouflage unit manuals and reconnaissance pilot logs, soldiers developed a technique using inverted shadows. They positioned highly reflective white canvases over their trenches and shelters, layered at angles that bounced and distorted shadows to mimic untouched snowdrifts, confusing enemy spotters. The necessity was stark. Avoiding detection was a matter of life and death, as enemy artillery relentlessly targeted visible human positions. Execution entailed calculating sun position every morning and adjusting canvas placements, using fabric stripped from uniforms and local cotton supplies for reflectivity. Success was quantifiable. Red Army units applying shadow camouflage decreased enemy airstrikes by nearly 40% in heavily bombarded sectors. This knowledge contributed to post-war developments in military camouflage technology and remains a study subject for fieldcraft specialists today. Another critical trick, number 10, was sun energy harvesting. Long before solar panels, soldiers constructed rudimentary solar reflectors to warm shelters and melt snow using discarded metallic ration tins and convex glass from broken binocular lenses. Declassified field inventor diaries describe how, during the winter of 1943 at the Kursk salient, engineers pieced together reflective arrays mounted on stationary wooden frames angled to catch the low winter sun, concentrating heat onto insulated water containers. The necessity arose because fuel was scarce, and constant melting of snow remained a burdensome chore risking exposure. Execution demanded precise craftsmanship, collecting damaged equipment parts, forming parabolic shapes, and rigorously adjusting angles with sunlight monitoring. This technique generated enough heat to melt daily water rations silently, boosting survival odds by maintaining hydration without fire. It represented human ingenuity overcoming environmental cruelty and is a precursor to modern passive solar heating systems, relearned by off-grid communities worldwide. The final and most harrowing method, number 11, was the freeze-dried body insulation. During the Battle of Murmansk in early 1944, where temperatures dropped to -50 degrees, Red Army medics pioneered an unconventional insulation method after discovering that dried reindeer moss and lichen, when frozen, trapped air and retained body heat better than bulky clothing. The necessity evolved from inflexible winter gear failing to protect extremities prone to frostbite, especially in prolonged static defense posts. The execution was intricate. Soldiers were instructed to wrap extremities tightly in layers of harvested moss and lichen, then seal these wrappings with cloth soaked in animal fat to lock in insulation and prevent moisture intrusion. This technique demanded foraging skills under enemy watch and careful layering to prevent crushing the insulating moss. Survival outcomes were staggering. Reports estimate that frostbite rates plummeted by 75% among troops employing freeze-dried insulation. For modern survivalists, this natural insulation strategy offers a biodegradable, low-weight option for extending warmth in extreme conditions when synthetic gear is unavailable. Reflecting on these 11 hidden Red Army winter tricks, it becomes painfully clear that survival was forged not on weapon strength, but in mastering the cold's merciless grip. They didn't survive with technology. They survived by understanding chemistry, biology, physics, and psychology when every conventional resource failed. Declassified documents reveal that some of these techniques were so feared by the Soviet command that, revealing them risked court-martial. They were lost in the chaos of war only to be resurrected decades later through painstaking archival work. The cost was immense. Thousands perished testing these methods, some names never recorded, sacrifices made in silence beneath snow and barbed wire. Yet their legacy teaches us that in any prolonged emergency, when the power grid disappears and modern comforts vanish, the knowledge of these simple yet brutal survival techniques can still save lives. When you consider the brutal winter landscapes of Eastern Europe, where those who mastered nature's cruelest weapon endured, you understand that survival is a science, an art, and an unyielding will wrapped in historical shadows. Today, preppers and military survival specialists study these methods, adapting Soviet ingenuity to modern crises and cold weather challenges worldwide. The final ironic revelation: many of these techniques arose from scarcity imposed by strategic failures, yet their effectiveness turned defeats into protracted resistance, buying time for a battered nation to rally and reclaim lost ground. So remember, these were not just tricks. They were weapons against oblivion, forged in frozen hells by those who refused to fade quietly into history's cold. Preserve this knowledge, for in the shadow of war and winter, it is the difference between dying and surviving